Hi, thank you. Thank you, Jill. I'll try to keep it as brief as possible. So, as she said, I'm British-Sudanese, so I'm here to give you a voice from the youth and a voice from the diaspora. I think one of the main challenges when you're born in the diaspora is you may feel British, but you also don't always have that sense of belonging to Sudan. So my connection was through family and through relatives, but not necessarily a deep-rooted belonging. It's somewhat superficial when you live abroad, because even when you're there, and no matter how much time you spend there, it's not the same as living there and living through the experiences that they live through. And we have different experiences when we're here, regardless of whether your family are political or not. And for me, my family are political, so that often meant that my experiences of going to Sudan were few and far between. Sometimes we could go, sometimes it was dangerous, and that's obviously because of the regime that was in place before. But one thing that I think is beautiful, and what has happened both in the diaspora and in Sudan, is as has been said, there's been a rise in the voice of the youth. The youth in Sudan were the ones that we saw on the street every day, and regardless of whether there are politicians talking and negotiating right now, the youth are the ones that were on the streets. Not to say that everyone wasn't on the streets, but the youth were there day and night. They were staying at the sit-in, they sacrificed their lives, they lost their friends, and they were the ones carrying their bodies to the hospitals. And what I've seen in the diaspora is a rise in their connectivity and a desire to get to know their country and a real pride in the country itself. And throughout the diasporas, I think all over the world, people have been joining together, and they've been forming youth committees and been trying to spread awareness about what has been happening, because as we know, this did happen in December. Things have been happening for generations, and oftentimes the news haven't wanted to speak about it, and governments haven't wanted to speak about it, and the previous regime did very well to suppress the voices of the youth. So one thing that I thought was very beautiful when I went there was the country felt different. You could feel the energy of the country, and you could feel the freedom, and you could feel people's voices even if you didn't hear people's voices. The streets were covered in art, you heard music, you saw dancing, as I'm sure you've seen in videos and footage, but it's really something that had to be felt, because what you have to understand when you look at Sudan then and you look at Sudan now is how much people had been suppressed. And I think that's one thing we have to take into consideration, is that you can't forget the youth now, because as much as we can talk about the politics, none of this would be happening without the youth. As I've said, they've sacrificed so much, and they're not willing to sit down. They have no political affiliations, whether it be people on the right or politicians on the left. They have no affiliations with either, because most of them were born into a Bashir era. They never had the chance to be political. And what's happened now with internet and social media is they've been able to see what's been happening globally. They've been able to connect with each other, and as we've seen, this has been a revolution through social media, because on June 3rd they closed down the internet, and the only way for people to find out what was happening was through the internet. They had to find their own means. We've seen through Facebook groups people identifying different people in different militias, whether it's Janjaweed, be it security services, whatever. And it's also been a way that they've been able to organise themselves. And one thing that I thought was so powerful when I was in Sudan is that you could see the organisation within them. Although there are younger people and they're not necessarily political, as you might say, and they did look to the SPA, who were, as we know, they're a trade union, they're not a political party, so they're not a party that they'll be voting for in the future, but they will be there to aid in the future of the country. But what I saw was the youth, especially when the internet shut down, you really got to see the power of the youth, because they were the people forming neighbourhood committees. There were people going door to door on the street, trying to protect their neighbourhoods. They were the people ensuring the safety of the neighbourhoods, ensuring that there were barricades at certain times, ensuring the safety of everyone, at a time when there was no politicians to look to. And the people that they looked at as politicians are army generals, and they're people that are going into their neighbourhoods and tormenting them. So I think what we really need to look at now is how we define politics and how we define politicians. Because beforehand what we saw in Sudan was politicians who, as I've said, are army generals, and it's one person in power. And when you have one person in power, the country is unstable. But when you have many people in power, as you've seen with the country right now, this is the voice of everyone. And if you can, obviously, you can't have the voice of everyone at a time. That's why we have politics, that's why we have political parties. But the voices still need to be listened to, because that's how you create a stable country. When you start suppressing other people's voices, that creates instability. And I think that's the future that the youth want for the country. They want their voices to be heard, and they want to change the social attitudes, because as we know, as we've said, there's mental health issues, there's been great atrocities that have been happened, and Sudanese, oftentimes we suppress what has happened. We don't like to talk about what has happened, or we alienate people because of what has happened. But this is a time where we can see, we've looked at Darfur before in the past and said, some of us know about it and some of us don't know about it, but it's not happening here. It happened to them, and it must have happened to them because there is something wrong with them. The country is split because there's been civil wars, but there's also been a great deal of racism, and that's something that the previous regime did very good. The previous regime were very good at separating people and creating the divide and saying, we're Arab, we're not African, these people are bad, these people are good. But what we're seeing now is a unity, and I think that's something that needs to be upheld, that the core values of what the youth were fighting for and the core values of what everyone were fighting for are the same. Everyone wants freedom, peace and justice, and regardless of whether you're British or regardless of whether you're Sudanese, those are global rights and
Rumi's cave may close within 1 hour.
global rights. And those are at the core of any society. That's what I have to say.